The signal came from a ship that had been declared dead for 40 years. Elias Vane heard it first as a smear of static crawling across the Silver Line's long-range array, a rhythm buried so deep in the noise floor that the ship's automated systems had almost filed it under cosmic background and moved on. It was Naomi Cortez, hands steady on the helm, who caught the pattern repeating every 11 seconds, a cadence no star or pulsar had ever produced. She pulled it forward, cleaned it, and played it through the cabin speakers. And the moment Elias heard the old identification chirp buried inside the static, the hair on his arms stood up. UNS Meridian's Grace, hull registry 7419, presumed lost with all hands in the hollow reach 4 decades ago. Nobody sent a distress call for 40 years and then started again. The hollow reach was not a place ships went looking for trouble, because trouble in that stretch of the galaxy did not need to be looked for. It found you. The region sat at the edge of mapped human space, a graveyard of dying stars and gravitational currents that bent light in ways that made navigation computers weep static into their logs. Explorers who ventured past its outer marker buoys either turned back with damaged instruments and stories they couldn't quite explain, or they didn't come back at all. The Meridian's Grace was the most famous of the ones that didn't come back. It had gone in with 312 souls aboard, chasing a cartographic anomaly that shouldn't have existed, and it had simply stopped transmitting one day mid-sentence, mid-thought, as if something had reached out and closed its hand around the ship's voice. Elias had grown up on stories about that ship. Every recon officer had. It was the reason there were rules now about how far you could push into unclaimed dark, the reason there were mandatory beacon checks and buddyship protocols. It was a ghost story that happened to be true, and ghost stories were not supposed to call you back 40 years later with a signal that had never once wavered from the exact frequency the Grace had used the day it vanished. "Confirm the ident code isn't a spoof," Elias said, leaning over Naomi's shoulder, watching the waveform pulse on the display like something breathing. "Already ran it 3 times," she said. "Cryptographic signature matches the archived registry. Whatever's out there either knows the Grace's private launch codes down to the last digit, or it is the Grace." Dr. Toma Reyes came up from the lab deck at the sound of raised voices, wiping engine grease from a data slate she'd been calibrating. And when she saw the waveform, her professional detachment slipped for exactly 1 second before she caught it and folded it back into place. She had spent 6 years studying the handful of recovered logs and wreckage fragments that had ever come out of the hollow reach, and she knew better than anyone aboard the Silver Line exactly how impossible this signal was. "If that's really the Grace," Toma said quietly, "then something kept its systems alive for 40 years in a region that fries navigation computers in under a week. That's not a distress call, that's a resurrection." The Silver Line was a salvage recon vessel, built for exactly this kind of work, small enough to slip through debris fields that would tear a larger ship apart, armed just enough to discourage the casual predator and not nearly enough to survive a determined one. Elias had commanded her for 6 years, mapping the edges of human territory, cataloging the wreckage the frontier left behind, occasionally pulling survivors out of situations that should have killed them. He was good at his job because he had learned, the hard way twice, that curiosity without discipline got people killed, and that discipline without curiosity meant you never found the things worth finding. He stood in the command chair's shadow for a long moment, weighing the decision the way he weighed every decision that mattered, turning it over until he could see all its edges. "We report it," he said finally, "and then we go take a look, quietly, 1 pass, minimal exposure, out before anything notices we were there." Nobody argued. That was the thing about a good crew, you didn't need to convince them the risk was worth taking, because they'd already run the same math you had and arrived at the same number. The jump into the hollow reach took 11 hours, threading through gravitational shear that made the Silver Line's hull groan like an old house settling in a storm. Elias watched the star charts warp and recalculate themselves in real time, watched 3 separate dying suns bleed slow rivers of plasma into the black, their light stretched and reddened by the space itself. It was beautiful in the way that certain kinds of danger were beautiful, vast and indifferent and utterly uninterested in whether a handful of humans survived their curiosity. They found the married Ian's grace drifting in the gravity well of a structure that shouldn't have existed. The derelict warship hung silent against a backdrop that made Elias mind refuse for several seconds to process what his eyes were showing him. Behind the broken silhouette of the old human vessel, filling nearly a third of the viewport, was something that could only be described as architecture, though no engineer in human history had ever built anything on this scale. It was a structure of interlocking rings and spires, kilometers across, dark as unlit iron, wrapped in threads of faint violet light that pulsed with no rhythm Elias could identify, slow and irregular like a heartbeat that had forgotten how fast it was supposed to beat. It orbited nothing. It simply hung there, anchored to the empty space between three collapsing stars as if gravity itself had agreed to leave it alone. That Toma breathed is not on any chart, not even the classified ones. The scan says it's old, Naomi said, voice tight. Older than old. The Grace's hull is practically new by comparison, and that ship's 40 years dead. Elias felt something settle in his chest, cold and certain. Whatever the Meridian's Grace had found 4 decades ago, it had found that structure first, and whatever had happened to its crew had happened somewhere in the shadow of those silent rings. Take us in slow, he said. We board the Grace only, we do not approach the structure, understood. They understood it didn't matter. Docking with a ghost was its own particular kind of unsettling. The Grace's airlock cycled on the first attempt, its ancient mechanisms grinding through 40 years of dormancy as though they had simply been waiting for someone to ask. Elias led with his sidearm drawn more out of habit than any real expectation of resistance. Toma close behind him with a scanner sweeping every surface, cataloging radiation levels and atmospheric composition with the clipped efficiency of someone using procedure to hold panic at arm's length. The air inside was breathable, stale but breathable, cycled, and recycled by systems that had never once failed in 4 decades of complete isolation. A fact that told Elias more about the sophistication of whatever had kept this ship intact than any amount of speculation could have. The Meridian's Grace was a tomb with the lights still on. Elias led the boarding party through corridors lit by emergency strips that flickered but never fully died, past cabins where personal effects sat undisturbed under decades of fine gray dust, as though everyone aboard had simply stepped out mid-task and never returned. There were no bodies. That was almost worse than finding bodies would have been. 312 people, and the ship held nothing of them except their absence, preserved with an eerie curatorial precision. In the command deck, they found the ship's log, and Toma pulled the last recorded entries onto a slate with hands that had stopped quite steady. The final captain's log, recorded 40 years and 6 days ago, was 11 seconds long. A woman's voice, calm in the particular way that meant she was holding calm together with both hands. She said they had found something that answered when they spoke to it. She said it was not hostile. She said it was waiting for someone, and it had been waiting a very long time, and she believed her voice cracked exactly once on the word believed that it recognized something in their blood. Then the recording ended, and the ship's systems, according to every log after that moment, had simply continued running on their own, untouched by human hands, faithfully preserving a vessel and a mystery for 40 years until 3 more humans were foolish enough or fated enough to come looking. Elias was still staring at the frozen waveform of that final log when the Silver Line's proximity alarm screamed through his earpiece. Something had emerged from the dark on the far side of the ancient structure, and it was not human, and it was not friendly, and it had already locked weapons on both ships before Naomi could even finish shouting the warning. The alien vessels came out of the shadow of the ancient rings in a formation that spoke of long-practiced dark hulls faceted like cut crystal, running lights the color of dying embers. There were 6 of them, sleek and asymmetrical in a way human engineering never was, built by minds that had never needed to agree with human aesthetics about what a warship should look like. Elias had exactly 4 seconds to register that they were surrounded before the first tractor beam locked onto the Silverline's hull and began, with terrible patience, to reel her in. "Naomi, get us out," Elias said, already moving toward the boarding party's shuttle, shoving Toma ahead of him through the Grace's corridors. "Working on it, but they've got us in a grip lock. I can't." Her voice cut off in a burst of static as something struck the Silverline hard in. That Elias felt the deck of the Grace shudder in sympathy, 40 meters away. He made a decision in the time it took to draw one breath, the kind of decision that would follow him for the rest of his life regardless of which way it went. He ordered Toma into the shuttle, ordered her to get back to the Silverline and help Naomi break free by any means necessary, and he stayed behind on the derelict to buy them the 2 extra minutes that decision would cost. It was the only variable he could control. Everything else belonged to the universe now. He watched through a cracked viewport as the shuttle streaked away, watched the Silverline twist and fire her engines against the tractor beam's pull with a violence that told him Naomi was flying like her life depended on it, because it did. He watched one of the alien ships break formation to intercept the shuttle instead of pursuing the larger prize, and for one savage half-second of hope, he thought they might actually make it. Then something vast and silent closed around the Meridian's Grace itself, and the last thing Elias Vane saw before the world went white and airless was the ancient structure's violet light flaring bright as a wound, and the strange, impossible sensation, clear and undeniable even as unconsciousness took him, of something enormous, somewhere far above and beneath and around him all at once, turning its attention toward the sound of his own heartbeat. He woke to the smell of ozone and the sound of a language built from harmonics no human throat could produce. The room they had put him in was not designed for cruelty in the way human cells were designed for cruelty. No exposed pipes to chain a prisoner to, no deliberate cold, no flickering light meant to fray the mind. It was simply alien, built to specifications that assumed its occupant did not need most of what a human body required. The walls curved without corners. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, a soft violet white that never dimmed. There was a shallow depression in the floor that Elias eventually understood was meant to be a bed, sized for a body that folded differently than his did. They came for him on what he estimated, by his own internal clock and the aching protest of his stomach, was the second day. 4 of them entered the cell, tall and angular, their bodies faceted like the hulls of their ships, skin the color of banked coals shot through with veins of that same violet light that pulsed through the ancient structure outside. They moved with a fluid, deliberate grace, and when they spoke to each other, their voices layered into harmonics, 2 or 3 tones at once, so that even their simplest exchanges sounded like fragments of music. Elias would learn in time that they called themselves the Ashari, and that among themselves they referred to their people as the choir, and that the being who led this particular delegation held a rank that translated roughly to Warden Marshal, a title that carried the weight of both soldier and priest. The Warden Marshal's name, once Elias finally earned the privilege of hearing it, was Chas Nyril, and Chas Nyril did not waste time on threats or theater. The first question, delivered through a translation device clipped to Elias' collar that rendered the layered alien harmonics into flat, mechanical human speech, was simple. "Why does your blood sing to the cradle?" Elias had no answer for that. He genuinely did not understand the question, and his honest confusion seemed to frustrate the Warden Marshal more than any lie could have. So began the weeks. They did not torture him, not in the way he had braced himself to expect. They asked the same handful of questions in 100 different arrangements, patient as erosion, patient as the dying stars burning slow and cold outside the station's viewports. Why did his blood sing to the cradle? What did his people know about the marked bloodlines? Why had the Meridian's Grace come here 40 years ago, and why had it never left? And why had its crew vanished into the structure's depths without a single body ever being recovered? Elias answered honestly over and over that he did not know, that he had never heard the word cradle before 3 days ago, that he was a reconnaissance officer investigating a distress call and nothing more. They did not believe him, and their disbelief was not cruel so much as it was afraid, and it took Elias almost 2 weeks to understand that the fear was the important part. On the fourth day, a different interrogator entered the cell, broader through the shoulders than Chas Nyril, marked with pale scarring across one side of his face that Elias would later learn was a badge of honor among the Ashari warrior caste rather than a wound to be hidden. He introduced himself through the translator only by rank chorus captain, and his questions had a different texture than the warden marshal's, less about the cradle itself and more abo. At the shape of human civilization, its numbers, its expansion, whether it too sent its wounded and its old into exile the way certain Ashari factions once had before the choir unified. Elias answered what he could without compromising anything strategic, and found, almost against his will, that he was curious about the answers he received in return. The Ashari he learned in scattered pieces, numbered perhaps 11 billion across some 40 settled systems, bound together not by centralized government, but by something closer to a shared liturgy, castes and duties passed down through family lines for so many generations that the original reasons behind them had calcified into something between law and religion. The warrior caste guarded. The scholar caste remembered. The song caste, smallest and strangest of the three, existed for a purpose no interrogator ever explained to him, though he noticed that whenever the topic arose, even the warden marshal's voice softened by some fractional, involuntary degree. He learned to read the architecture of his captivity the way a sailor learns to read weather. Days when the corridors outside his cell hummed with a particular resonance meant a fleet exercise was underway somewhere beyond the station, and those days brought shorter, more perfunctory interrogations, as though his captor's attention was divided. Days when the violet light along the walls pulsed unusually slow meant he eventually understood that something in the cradle itself had stirred, however faintly, and those days brought the warden marshal in person, tense and searching, asking the same questions with a new and specific edge of dread. He was given food of a sort thin gray paste that his body tolerated poorly at first and then adapted to out of sheer necessity. He was given water. He was, in the strictest sense, kept alive with something that might even have been called care, if care could exist alongside the constant, grinding pressure of interrogation. And every few days, one interrogator in particular would linger after the others had gone, ostensibly to run diagnostic scans on his physical condition, and would ask him quiet questions that had nothing to do with the cradle at all. Her name was Ren Sol Vei, and she held the rank the translator rendered as scholar adjunct, and unlike the warden marshal, her questions came from something that sounded, even filtered through mechanical translation, uncomfortably like curiosity rather than suspicion. "You keep a small object," she said, on what he thought was perhaps the 9th or 10th day, gesturing at the thin metal band still on his wrist, a cheap civilian chronometer that had somehow survived confiscation because it registered on their scanners as inert and harmless. "You touch it when you are afraid. Why?" "It was my sister's," Elias said, because at that point exhaustion had worn away most of his instinct to guard information, and because the honest answer cost him nothing. "She gave it to me before I shipped out on my first deployment, told me it would keep me on time for things that mattered." Ren Solvay was quiet for a long moment, her violet-veined face unreadable in ways human faces never quite managed to be. "The choir does not keep such things," she said eventually. "Attachment to a single object across years tied to a single absent person. It is inefficient, and yet I find I understand it." It was a small moment, barely worth noticing on its own, but it was the first thread of something that was not simple captivity. And Elias, starved for anything that wasn't fear or interrogation, held onto it the way a drowning man holds onto driftwood. He learned in fragments stolen from careful questions and careless answers, the shape of what he had stumbled into. The structure the humans had found, the one the Ashari called the cradle, was not a weapon and not a fortress in any sense he understood. It was older than the Ashari civilization itself. Older, Ren Solvay admitted once in a moment of unguarded honesty, than any species currently living in this arm of the galaxy. It had been built, according to Ashari scripture and scholarship both, by a vanished people the choir called the Halcyon, a race that had walked between stars the way humans walked between rooms, that had shaped whole systems the way a sculptor shaped clay, and that had disappeared so completely, so many hundreds of thousands of years ago, that not even their bones remained to be studied. The Ashari had not built the cradle. The Ashari had inherited it, or more precisely, had inherited the duty of guarding it, a duty passed down through their civilization for longer than human recorded history had existed, sworn by an ancestor generation the current Ashari barely remembered the reasoning of. What they did remember, drilled into every Ashari from birth with the weight of religious certainty, was that the cradle must never wake, and that the only thing capable of waking. It was the presence of what their ancient texts called the marked, descendants of the Halcyon's own bloodline, scattered across the galaxy in the ages after their makers vanished. Carrying a genetic resonance, the cradle could recognize the way a lock recognizes its key. For 40 years, the Ashari had believed the marked were extinct, or at least absent from this stretch of space. Then the Meridian's grace had arrived, carrying, somewhere among its 312 souls, a bloodline that made the cradle's ancient systems stir for the first time in millennia. The Ashari had moved to contain the situation. They had drawn the ship in, studied its crew, tried and failed to determine which of them carried the resonance strong enough to be dangerous. And in the chaos of that effort, Ren Solvay would never fully explain the details, and Elias suspected even she did not know all of them, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The crew of the Meridian's grace had vanished. Not killed, she insisted, with an intensity that suggested this distinction mattered enormously to her. Vanished. Taken somewhere the Ashari themselves could not follow, drawn into the cradle's depths by whatever the ship's resonance had triggered, and never released. "You fear I'm one of them," Elias said, on a day he had stopped counting precisely but guessed was somewhere past the third week. "One of the marked." "I fear it because your blood already sings," Ren Solvay said quietly. "Faintly at first, louder now. The Warden Marshal believes it is growing because you are lying to us, hiding some ritual or activation your people have taught you. I do not believe that. I have listened to you for many days now, human, and I do not believe you are capable of the kind of lying he suspects. I believe the resonance is growing because proximity itself is enough. I believe it would grow in you whether you wished it or not, because it is not a choice you are making. It is simply what you are. Before this story finishes unfolding, I want to ask something of you directly, because stories like this one only keep finding their way to new listeners when the people who love them help carry them forward. If the mystery of the cradle and the weight of what Elias is slowly uncovering has you leaning in, take half a second to tap the like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so the next signal from the hollow reach doesn't slip past you when it arrives. And I'd genuinely like to know, down in the comments, tell me what you think the Halcyon really were, and what you believe is waiting for Elias Vane at the bottom of that ancient, patient structure. Now, back to the interrogation that was never really an interrogation at all. What none of the Ashari understood, not the Warden Marshal in his fear-driven suspicion, not even Ren Solvay in her careful, curious sympathy, was the truth Elias himself did not learn until much later, pieced together from a scrap of the Grace's recovered records that Toma had managed to pull before the boarding party split apart. His grandmother, a name he barely remembered from childhood photographs and half-told family stories, had served as a junior engineer aboard the Meridian's Grace on an earlier tour, decades before that final doomed expedition, and had survived a brief, unexplained illness during a routine patrol along the very edge of the Hollow Reach. She had recovered. She had gone home. She had married, had children, had grandchildren, and had died peacefully in her sleep 40 years before her old ship ever returned to the region that had, without her knowledge or anyone else's, quietly rewritten something fundamental in her blood and passed it forward, generation to generation, dormant and unnoticed, until it arrived entirely by accident in the body of a reconnaissance officer named Elias Vane. Investigating a distress signal he had no way of knowing was calling out to something already sleeping inside him. He was not a spy. He was not a weapon planted deliberately. He was an inheritance nobody had known existed, walking unknowingly into the one place in the galaxy capable of recognizing what he carried. There was something almost unbearably human in that realization when it finally reached him, weeks later in full, that the danger everyone around him had spent so much energy fearing had never been a plan or a weapon at all. Only the quiet, accidental persistence of a woman's love for a ship she had once served aboard, folded invisibly into her descendants for 2 generations, waiting for a moment none of them could have chosen or predicted. The weeks wore on, and the questioning continued, and Elias watched the Ashari station shift around him in small, telling ways he was not meant to notice. Instruments malfunctioned when he was brought too close to certain corridors. The violet threads of light woven through the station's architecture, faint and slow when he first arrived, began to pulse with a rhythm that increasingly, unmistakably, matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Warden Marshal Chas Nyril grew shorter in his questioning. More clipped, more afraid, and fear in a being who commanded warships was its own kind of warning. Guards who had once regarded Elias with clinical detachment began, in small, unconscious ways, to keep more distance from his cell than the room's dimensions strictly required. He asked Ren Solvay about it. Once, in the deep, quiet hours, she had begun visiting more than her duties required. She had told him, on an earlier visit he had turned over in his mind many times since, about the song cast's true purpose, sharing it with a hesitance that suggested she was breaking some quiet rule in doing so. The song cast, she explained, existed to remember the Halcyon directly, not through scholarship but through a kind of inherited ritual performance, harmonic patterns passed down unchanged for hundreds of generations. Sounds that no living Ashari fully understood the meaning of anymore, but that every Ashari recognized on some instinctive level as sacred. It had never occurred to her cast of scholars, she admitted, to wonder whether those patterns might be closer to language than liturgy, might be, in fact, an echo of an actual Halcyon voice preserved by accident across 400,000 years of careful, unquestioning repetition. Elias had asked her gently whether she'd ever tried to have the patterns analyzed the way a human linguist might analyze an unfamiliar dialect, and her silence in response had told him everything about how deeply the fear of disturbing the cradle's mysteries ran through every layer of Ashari society, scholar and warrior alike. "You're afraid of me," he said, "not an accusation, an observation." "I am afraid of what is happening around you," she corrected, and there was something raw beneath the mechanical flatness of the translation, something that might in a human voice have been grief. "The resonance is no longer faint, Elias Vane. It has not been faint for many days. The Warden Marshal believes we should have ended this already, that you should have been given to the deep systems for study the way your predecessors from the Grace were given. I have argued against this. I do not know how much longer my arguments will hold." There were nights he had begun by then to trust his own internal sense of night and day, though the station's light never changed to mark the difference. When Elias lay in the shallow depression that served as his bed and thought not about escape, which seemed increasingly like a fantasy with no honest path attached to it, but about why he had chosen this work in the first place. He had grown up in a settlement on the rim of human space, close enough to the frontier that stories of the dark beyond it were not entertainment but a kind of inherited caution. And he had joined the Reconnaissance Corps not out of any grand ambition to be first at anything, but because he had wanted, simply and stubbornly, to understand the shape of the silence surrounding humanity's small, bright pocket of the galaxy. He had believed, the way most explorers believed somewhere beneath their professional detachment, that understanding was safer than ignorance, that a mapped danger was a danger you could plan around, and a mystery left alone only grew teeth in the dark. Lying in an alien cell with his blood apparently answering to something no chart had ever recorded, he found that belief tested in ways it had never been tested before and found to his own quiet surprise that it held anyway. He did not regret going aboard the Grace. He did not regret staying behind to buy Naomi and Toma their 2 minutes. Fear was a reasonable response to what was happening to him, but it had not, even at its worst, convinced him that the not knowing would have been better. "Why do you keep arguing then?" he asked. "If I'm as dangerous as your warden marshal believes, wouldn't it be simpler to just be done with me?" Ren Solvay was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped into a register the translator struggled to render smoothly, something almost too honest for the mechanical device to keep pace with. "Because I have spent 4 weeks listening to a being my entire civilization was taught to fear," she said. "And in that time you have told me about a sister who gave you a broken chronometer and a crew you stayed behind to save, and a species that sends its children into the dark not to conquer it but to understand it. My people have guarded a secret for longer than memory, Elia's vein, and in all that time we forgot to ask ourselves whether the thing we were guarding against was actually a danger or whether it was simply unfamiliar. I do not know which is true, but I no longer believe the answer is as simple as the warden marshal insists it is." While Elias counted days by the changing quality of alien light, Naomi Cortez and Toma Reyes were counting them differently, in fuel reserves and dwindling supply margins, in the slow, deliberate work of staying alive at the ragged edge of a region that had already claimed one human vessel for 40 years. The Silver Line had broken free of the Ashari tractor lock only by the narrowest of margins, Naomi threading the ship through a collapsing debris field with a recklessness she would later downplay in every retelling, and the two of them had made the only decision either could live with afterward. They did not run for human space. They went dark instead, cutting power to everything but life support and passive sensors, drifting in the gravitational shadow of one of the hollow reaches' dying stars, and they watched. It was not glamorous work. It was weeks of Toma parsing fragments of a Shari fleet chatter their equipment was never designed to intercept. Weeks of Naomi rationing power cell by power cell to keep the ship cold enough to avoid detection while still warm enough to keep two humans alive. Weeks of neither of them saying aloud the possibility that they were watching a station that might already have killed the man they'd come to save. They built a rough picture of the Ashari station's patrol rhythms, its shift changes, the handful of predictable gaps in its sensor coverage, not because they had a plan yet, but because information was the only thing keeping hope from curdling into despair. Toma cataloged every scrap of the ancient structure's light patterns with the obsessive discipline of a scientist who needed her hands busy to keep her mind from imagining the worst. And somewhere in the 4th week of that vigil, she found the pattern that would matter more than either of them yet understood. The cradle's violet pulses were slowing, deepening, growing steadily louder across every frequency their instruments could register, as though something enormous were taking longer and longer breaths. "That's not decay," Toma said quietly, staring at the data. "That's a heartbeat picking up its rhythm. Something out there is waking up." Neither of them knew yet what that meant for Elias. Both of them, without needing to discuss it, agreed it meant they were not leaving until they found out. It was the closest thing to friendship Elias had found in that place, fragile and complicated and built entirely on stolen hours. And it was the reason he was not entirely alone 3 days later when everything finally came apart. The Warden Marshal made his decision on what Elias would later calculate was the 31st day of his captivity, and he made it with the particular ruthless efficiency of a leader who had run out of patience and had never had much faith in patience to begin with. Elias was taken from his cell not to another interrogation chamber, but down, through corridors that grew progressively less like the sleek Ashari architecture above and more like something older, rougher, half-fused with material that pulsed faintly violet under a layer of dark, ancient metal. He understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in the last moments before something irreversible happens, that he was being taken to the cradle itself, that the Ashari had decided the only way to resolve the question his existence posed was to feed him into the same machinery that had swallowed the crew of the Meridian's Grace 40 years before, and see what came out the other side if anything did. Ren Solvay walked beside the guard detail the entire way, and her silence said more than any argument could have. They brought him into a chamber that defied the geometry of everything around it, a vast open space where the station's architecture simply stopped pretending to be a station and became instead a threshold into something the ancient Halcyon had built and the Ashari had never fully understood. The walls were not walls but curtains of slow violet light, folding and unfolding in patterns that made Elias' eyes ache to follow them. And at the center of the chamber, suspended in absolutely nothing, hung a single sphere of dark material no larger than a human head, radiating a pressure that Elias felt not in his ears or his skin but somewhere deeper, in the marrow of his bones, in the blood his grandmother had unknowingly carried home from this exact stretch of space 4 decades ago. "Bring him closer," the warden marshal ordered, and his voice, even flattened by the translator, carried a note of something that might have been triumph or might have been terror. And in that moment, Elias suspected the being himself no longer knew which. Elias did not resist as the guards brought him forward, because there was nothing left to resist with, no weapon, no leverage, no plan that 31 days of careful, exhausted honesty had bought him. But as the pressure in the room built, as the violet light began to bend visibly toward him like iron filings drawn to a magnet, he understood wit. Sudden, absolute clarity that Ren Solvay had been more right than she knew, and more wrong than either of them could have guessed. He thought with the strange clarity that fear sometimes lends a person, of every question the warden marshal had asked him over 5 weeks, every accusation dressed as inquiry, and understood now that the being had been asking the wrong question the entire time. He had never once asked what Elias wanted. He had only asked what Elias was, as though a person could be reduced entirely to the accident of what ran in their blood, and in that failure of imagination, the warden marshal had guaranteed the very outcome he had spent 5 weeks trying to prevent. Fear, Elias thought, watching the light bend toward him like something starving, does not protect you from the thing you're afraid of. It only guarantees you meet it unprepared. He had never been the dangerous one, he had simply been the key, and the warden marshal in his fear had just placed that key directly into the lock. The sphere at the center of the chamber did not explode, and it did not attack, and for one long suspended moment nothing happened at all except that every pulse of violet light in the room slowed deliberately to match the rhythm of Elia's own frightened heartbeat. Then the sphere unfolded. It did not open like a door or crack like a shell. It simply became, in the space of a single breath, something vastly larger than the small dark object it had been a moment before. A lattice of light and structure blooming outward through the chamber and the walls beyond it. And Elias would later understand through the entire ancient body of the cradle itself. Kilometers of dormant machinery waking in a wave that began at the exact point where he stood and rippled outward faster than sound, faster than the guards could react. Faster than the warden marshals shouted, harmonic orders could do anything but dissolve into the noise of a system 400,000 years old finally opening its eyes. The voice that spoke was not a voice at all, not in any sense Elias' ears could process, but a presence that unfolded directly into his understanding the way sunlight unfolds into a dark room, immediate and total and utterly without translation devices or mechanical intermediaries. It called him kin. It called him lost and found, late and expected, and in the flood of information that came with those impressions, Elias understood, in fragments too vast for a single human mind to hold all at once, that the Halcyon had not vanished the way the Ashari believed. They had scattered deliberately across 10,000 worlds in the ages before their final departure, seeding their bloodline into younger species not as conquest, but as a kind of quiet, patient hope. A belief that intelligence given enough time and enough distance from its origin would eventually rediscover what it had lost. And that when it did, the cradle would be waiting to welcome it home rather than punish it for having forgotten. The crew of the Meridian's Grace had not been destroyed 40 years ago. They had been held gently in a kind of suspension that Ashari's instruments had simply lacked the sophistication to detect, kept safe inside the cradle's ancient systems while it waited patiently for a resonance strong enough to fully wake it. Elia's grandmother's dormant, inherited spark had not been enough on its own, decades ago, brief and faint and never returning to the region again. But her grandson, standing now in the chamber's center, carrying that same inheritance refined and concentrated by whatever quiet biological process ran beneath human genetics, had been enough. The chamber's light did not burn or destroy. It simply gathered and lifted, and Elias felt himself borne upward through the unfolding lattice with a gentleness that stood in stark, almost cruel contrast to the panic exploding around him. Guards firing weapons that dissolved into harmless sparks before they crossed half the chamber. The Warden Marshal's harmonic voice cracking into something raw and wordless. Ren Solvay standing frozen at the chamber's edge with an expression Elias would spend the rest of his life trying to properly translate. He did not lose consciousness this time. He simply watched, suspended in light older than every civilization currently living in the galaxy, as 312 figures resolved slowly out of the cradle's deep architecture around him, disoriented, blinking, aged not a single visible day since the moment 40 years ago when their voices had gone silent mid-sentence. The crew of the Meridian's Grace returned all at once, exactly as they had been the instant the cradle first drew them in. Standing bewildered in a chamber none of them recognized as anything but the ending of a single very long, very strange dream. The Warden Marshal's fear in the end did what fear so often does. It made the danger real by trying too hard to. Oh, prevented. What followed was not a battle, though for several terrible minutes it felt like one might begin. The Ashari fleet outside the station scrambled into defensive formation as the cradle's ancient systems came fully online, its vast architecture reorganizing itself around Elias and the returned crew of the Grace with a slow, deliberate patience that made clear it considered the Ashari's panic to be exactly that panic, not a genuine threat requiring genuine retaliation. No weapons fired from the awakened structure. No devastation rained down on the station or its fleet. The cradle, it seemed, had waited 400,000 years for this moment, and it was not interested in spending its long-delayed reunion on violence against the descendants of the people who had, however fearfully, kept its secret safe all that time. It simply opened a path. Elias felt it as much as saw it, a channel carved through the folded light connecting the cradle's heart directly to the space where the silver line, battered but alive, alongside the shuttle Toma and Naomi had somehow kept flying through weeks of Ashari pursuit and containment, still hung in the dark beyond the station's hull. The two crews had not been idle during his captivity. They had shadowed the region at the ragged edge of Ashari sensor range, unwilling to abandon him, gathering what intelligence they could, waiting for an opening that had finally, impossibly, arrived on its own terms. Ren Solvay was the one who cut through the Warden Marshal's frozen shock and gave the order that mattered, her harmonic voice sharp with an authority Elias had never heard her use before, commanding the guards to stand down, commanding the fleet to hold fire, buying with her own reputation and her own considerable personal risk the handful of minutes it took for Elias to guide the disoriented, weeping, grateful crew of the Meridian's Grace through the opened channel, and into the waiting arms of two human ships that had never once given up on finding them. He was the last one through. He turned back just once at the threshold between the cradle's ancient light and the ordinary dark of open space, and found Ren Solvay watching him from the chamber's edge, her expression unreadable but her posture, for the first time in 5 weeks, entirely without fear. "Tell your people," she said, and the translator caught every word this time clean and certain, that the choir kept its promise for 400,000 years, whether or not we understood what we were promising. Tell them we are willing now to learn what comes next if they are willing to teach us. Elias did not have an answer worthy of that moment, so he gave her the only thing he had left to give, the small, cheap chronometer still fastened to his wrist, the one his sister had given him a lifetime ago, the one that had somehow survived 31 days of captivity registering as nothing more than harmless, inert metal. He pressed it into her hand before the channel began to close, and he told her, in words the translator rendered as best it could, that it would keep her on time for things that mattered, and that he intended, very much, to come back someday and ask for it again. The cradle's light folded closed behind him a heartbeat later, and the ancient structure settled back into its long, patient dark, though never again, Elias suspected, into anything as deep or as forgotten as the sleep it had woken from. The return journey to human space took the better part of 3 weeks, filled with debriefings and medical scans, and the slow, careful work of 312 people learning how to exist again in a universe that had moved 40 years past the moment they last remembered living in it. A larger recovery vessel met them at the edge of the hollow reach, dispatched the moment Naomi's emergency transmission reached the nearest relay station, and the transfer of 312 disoriented, grieving, overjoyed souls took the better part of 2 days, each one processed with the particular tenderness reserved for people who existed, by every official record, only as names on a memorial wall. Elias watched some of those reunions happen in real time over the ship's internal feeds, unable to look away even when the weight of them grew almost unbearable. A man in his 60s, greeted by a daughter who had been 11 years old the last time he'd seen her, now a mother herself with children of her own who had grown up believing their grandfather was nothing more than a name carved into cold stone. A woman who learned, gently and carefully by a counselor trained for exactly this impossible circumstance, that her husband had remarried 9 years into her absence, had grieved her honestly and completely before choosing, eventually, to keep living, and who had to decide in the space of a single overwhelming afternoon what forgiveness for that kind of grief was even supposed to look like. There was no single shape to the way 40 years lost could be absorbed back into a life. Elias watched people laugh and weep and stand in stunned silence, sometimes all three within the same hour, and he understood that whatever the Ashari had done wrong in guarding their secret, the cost of that secret had not been paid in violence. It had been paid in exactly this, in decades quietly stolen from ordinary people who had only ever wanted to come home. He spent most of that journey not in his own quarters, but in the makeshift infirmary bay where the Grace's former crew were adjusting, one difficult conversation at a time, to grandchildren they had never met and worlds that had changed beyond easy recognition. And he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that this slow work of reconnection felt more important than anything the Ashari interrogators had spent 5 weeks trying to extract from him. He thought often, in the quiet hours between debriefings, about Ren Solvay's last words, about a species that had spent 400,000 years guarding a secret out of fear before finally, in a single unplanned moment, discovering that the thing they feared had never been the danger it appeared to be. He thought about the Warden Marshal's harmonic voice cracking under the weight of a threat that turned out to be nothing more than an old promise finally coming due. He thought mostly about how close the whole encounter had come to becoming a tragedy instead of a reunion, not because either side had been evil, but because fear, given enough time and enough silence to grow in, could build walls around a truth so thick that even the people guarding it forgot what they were actually protecting. Humanity's formal response to the Ashari choir would take months to organize. Careful diplomatic channels opened slowly and cautiously on both sides, colored by the knowledge that an ancient, patient intelligence now sat awake at the heart of a region both species had spent generations calling forbidden. But that was a story for other people to finish. Admirals and diplomats and scholars who would spend careers untangling what the Cradle's awakening actually meant for two civilizations, suddenly forced to reconsider everything they thought they understood about the galaxy's oldest silences. For Elias Vane, the story ended for now in a quieter place. It ended with Naomi Cortez flying the Silverline home through familiar starlanes for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, with Toma Reyes cataloging 5 weeks of impossible data with the fierce, quiet joy of a scientist who had just been handed the single greatest discovery of her career, with 312 rescued souls stepping back onto human soil to reunions 40 years overdue, weeping in doorways that had long since stopped expecting them. It ended with Elias standing alone on the Silverline's observation deck as the ship crossed back over the border into mapped, familiar space, watching the hollow reach shrink behind them into just another dark smudge on the star charts, no longer a graveyard but something stranger and more hopeful, a threshold rather than an ending. He thought about a chronometer now resting in an alien scholar's hand somewhere among the Ashari fleet, keeping time in a language it had never been built for, and he thought about the ancient intelligence sleeping lighter now, somewhere in that dark, no longer entirely alone. He had spent 5 weeks believing, the way everyone around him had believed, that he was the one in danger, small and captive and afraid in a cell built for a body that wasn't his. It had taken the whole slow unraveling of that captivity to understand the truth underneath it, that the danger had never really belonged to him at all. It had belonged to the fear itself, patient and ancient and mistaken, and to everyone who had let that fear stand guard for so long that they forgot to ask what they were actually protecting, and what they might have found so much sooner if they had simply had the courage to ask instead of the discipline to guard. There was a woman among the returned crew, an elderly systems technician named Dara Osai, who found Elias on the observation deck that final evening and stood beside him without speaking for a long while, watching the same stars he was watching. She had been 19 years old when the Meridian's grace vanished, engaged to be married, her whole ordinary life waiting for her on a colony world she had expected to see again within the year. She told him quietly that she had spent 5 weeks inside the cradle believing barely an hour had passed, that the hardest part of coming home was not the missing decades but the strange, guilty relief of realizing she had not had to live through losing them. She asked him if he thought the Ashari had done wrong, keeping their secret so long, and Elias found he didn't have a simple answer for her, only the truth as he'd come to understand it, tha. Fear inherited long enough stops feeling like fear at all, and starts feeling like duty, and that the line between protecting something and imprisoning it can vanish so slowly that entire civilizations forget where it used to be. Dara nodded and did not ask him anything else, and after a while she went below to find the family that had been waiting 40 years to ask her the same kinds of questions. And Elias stayed alone with the stars until Naomi's voice came softly over the deck comm to tell him they'd cleared the last of the region's gravitational currents, and human space, familiar and unremarkable and entirely his own, was opening up ahead of them at last. He thought one final time of Ren Solvay standing at the threshold of that ancient chamber, fear finally gone from her posture, a small human chronometer closing in her hand like a promise neither of them yet knew how to keep. He thought of 312 people walking back into lives that had moved on without them, choosing, one after another, to begin again anyway. He thought of a species that had guarded a secret for 400,000 years out of a fear so old it had outlived the memory of its own reasoning, and of how little violence, in the end, it had actually taken to set that fear down. The galaxy, Elias had learned, kept its oldest secrets not behind locked doors but behind inherited silences, and somewhere out past the edge of every chart humanity had ever drawn, more of those silences were still waiting, patient as dying stars, for someone willing to listen closely enough to hear them finally, quietly begin to answer back.